Good morning. Welcome back in today's part 19 of Losing the Boomer Blues. Continuing on. When they arrived at the Surfing Museum, Mary and Joe enjoyed the exhibits and the wealth of surfing history they discovered. The Mark Abbott Memorial Lighthouse was California's first surfing museum. It was built in memory of Mark Abbott, who was killed in a surfing accident in 1965. Joe bought Mary a Woody alarm clock in the gift shop as a souvenir and a reminder of their date in his vintage '57 Chevy. After a full day in Santa Cruz, they returned to Joe's place, where they lit some candles to set a romantic mood. Joe had prepared dinner in his slow cooker that morning, and when they arrived home, dinner was almost ready. Mary set the table, Joe poured them both a glass of wine, and they reflected upon the day as they ate beef stew surrounded by candlelight. Later, they watched TV and ate popcorn. Mary fell asleep during the 11 o'clock news, resting her head on Joe's shoulder. Joe turned off the TV and Mary woke up. "Wow, I was out like a light." "That you were. I think it's time we turn in." "I agree with you, Joe. Tomorrow morning I'll make breakfast for us." Joe was pleasantly surprised. No one had prepared breakfast for him in years. He placed his apron on the kitchen table, winked at Mary, and said, "That's really thoughtful of you. It's only fair since you and your slow cooker made dinner for us tonight." They both laughed as they headed to their separate bedrooms. Mary knocked on Joe's bedroom door at 8 o'clock the next morning. She announced that breakfast was almost ready. He took a quick shower, got dressed, and came out of his room ready to join her. They enjoyed scrambled eggs and toast along with a cup of coffee. Joe volunteered to wash the dishes after they ate. Mary was packed and ready to leave by the time Joe was done cleaning up in the kitchen. "The time we spent together went by too fast. We'll have to get together again this weekend," stated Joe. "Dinner at my place on Saturday? What about lunch at Mel's Diner? You still have to compare their cooking to mine." Mary smiled and said, "There's no comparison, Joe, but we'll do that if you like." "I like." They both chuckled and hugged one another goodbye. Joe kissed her tenderly, and off she went down the path to her car, smiling back at him and waving. Her drive home was pleasant. She was so happy that she didn't notice the traffic. She was on cloud 9. It was amazing how comfortable she and Joe were with each other. Their friendship was growing stronger. Chapter 11. Mary, Jane, and Lucy decide to dress retro for the reunion. Mary, Jane, and Lucy rode the bus downtown. Their goal was to find something to wear to their reunion. Mary, of course, wore her vintage sunglasses. While in Union Square, they noticed that the latest fashions in the department stores failed to excite them, so they decided to look for clothing that was 60s inspired. Unable to find anything they wanted to wear, they arrived at the realization that it would be so much fun to dress authentically retro. A vintage clothing shop was what they needed. They knew just the shop, so they walked to the Market Street subway and waited for the streetcar to take them to their favorite vintage clothing shop in the Haight. Jane and Lucy wondered what Bob and Fred would think about dressing retro. As they stood in the Market Street tunnel, waiting for the Enjuta, Mary said excitedly, "I asked Joe to be my date, and I think he'll be willing to go along with dressing retro. He's been wearing my sunglasses and reminiscing with me a lot lately. I bet it'll be right up his alley. He might have some 60s clothing in his closet. I'll ask him about it." The streetcar arrived, and as they were boarding, Lucy responded, "I think Fred would go along with it too. After all, girls just want to have fun, and hopefully guys understand that." As they sat on the streetcar, they recalled the miniskirts, hot pants, and granny dresses of the 60s. Everyone was into expressing themselves back then. The music of the day brought about many changes in fashion. Hairstyles were long on men, like Tiny Tim and John Lennon, while it was both short and long on women like Twiggy and Cher. The style of clothing was becoming more of a form of self-expression in the 60s due to the hippie movement. The summer of love, hip culture, and psychedelic rock music scene influenced a new, earthy, bohemian style in clothing. Mary asked, "Do you remember back in the day when we wore beaded necklaces and Indian print shirt dresses? We bought them in head shops along Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley." Jane reflected, "Of course I remember that. Do you remember the costumes the bands wore in the 60s? Mary replied, "Yes, I loved watching Jimi Hendrix perform dressed in his bright-colored ruffled shirts, bell-bottom pants, and his acid headband wrapped tightly around his afro." "Yep," said Lucy, "Hendrix had a style all of his own. No one, and I mean no one, could play guitar quite like him. I remember the Bay Area band, William Penn and his pals. They reminded me so much of Paul Revere and the Raiders dressed in their Revolutionary War costumes. And who could ever forget the Grateful Dead, wearing their tie-dyed tees and tattered blue jeans? I love Jerry Garcia's patriotic top hat." The 60s San Francisco music scene was a revolutionary experience, and fashion evolved right along with it. Mary added, "We wore African print dresses and love beads not only to concerts but to school, and on the weekend too. The music of the 60s inspired us to express ourselves through our clothing and our music. Longshoremen's Hall, the Fillmore Auditorium, and Avalon Ballroom were all a big part of hippie life in the 60s, and fashion really played a huge part during that time." Jane replied, "Bob and the Flames were one of the Bay Area's first garage bands, and they had a unique style even though they were a Beatles cover band. Their presence on stage was just as fab as the Beatles, thanks to their sharp baby blue suits and their raw musical talent." Lucy replied, "Our guys were outstanding musicians and hip dressers. They always got folks out on the dance floor shaking a tail feather. Bob and the Flames never made top billing, but they attracted a large local following. There was no doubt about it. The old hippie chicks wanted to look nostalgic for their 50th. They felt compelled to bring back the 60s on the night of their reunion. It might not appeal to everyone, but for them it rocked." They were elated that the reunion would be held in their old high school gym. What better place to travel back in time? When they got off the streetcar on Haight Street, they headed straight to Held Over. They found just what they were looking for at last. There were lots of 60s outfits on the racks. The clothing was youthful, but that didn't matter to them. They were willing to go back in time, because after all, it was their generation, and young or old, girls just want to have fun. Jane played the 80s tune on her harmonica as they walked away from Held Over with their bags filled with 60s clothing. We'll start chapter 12 later, and that's Mary's progress report. So I hope that you have a nice day. Take care and ciao.